What have you got for us today?
Yeah, it's not really much of a topic. It's just I've been doing a little bit of reading. There's a issue that comes up a lot, I think, for people who were raised in fundamentalist brands of religion, and it could probably apply to other things as well, but it's just something that I see a lot in the atheist community with people who have fundamentalist backgrounds, who have difficulty sort of describing what it was like to experience that complete change of worldview, especially for people who have that experience really quickly. So if you've been indoctrinated and you've accepted you're a believing Christian and then that starts to crumble underneath you, it can be a difficult thing for some people. And one of the common experiences that I hear expressed to me frequently by this group is the difficulty in getting people who have not had that experience to understand the gravity of what it can mean for a person. So that what happens is sometimes when someone hears it, they'll say something like, oh yeah, I know what that's like because I remember I used to believe like this or that, and it will be something, like a particular fact about the world, and then they'll say, and then I remember when I found out I was wrong about that, and I was really crushed.
So the one group's talking about kind of the emotive, core, essential experience, and the other one's saying, oh yeah, I used to believe that Noah built an ark too.
Or I used to believe that we didn't really go to the moon. Or, and there's a certain, and that's even extreme. I've had people use examples with me that were much less, I want to say, what's the word, like impactive of your life. So just a misconception that you had, you know, and the idea that when I was 12, I used to believe in Bigfoot, and I don't believe in Bigfoot anymore. And it's like, well, it's not quite apples to apples, because this really gets into every aspect of your life in a way that when the rug comes out, it doesn't just come out in a certain area. It comes out of everything. And so for a very long time, I've tried to grapple with certain issues of that were intertwined with other things. And one of the other things that I've had difficulty with is the idea of what I labeled a belief. Because what I consider my beliefs now are not in the same category with what I called beliefs at the time I was expressing religious beliefs. When I was expressing religious beliefs, it was literally just sort of this is what we believe, and it was adopting or accepting just a core set of, you know, facts that were given to me to go out and defend. And there wasn't really a lot of research allowed outside of a very narrow area. So you could examine your religious issues in a small area, but you didn't go beyond it. So for a lot of people that I went to church with, we had all these classes asking all these questions about the Bible and what does God mean by that, and but there is never a class on, you know, is there really a God? And let's take a look at, you know, counter-apologetics historically and see, you know, in a really honest way what's going on there. So there was never really an honest search for what was going on for me before I adopted the Christian perspective. So I became a Christian after a couple years of just sort of floating around, but not really searching. And the whole time I was doing it, I was adopting the Christian sort of framework for how do you search for God, like praying every night for a sign and things like this. So there wasn't really let me go to the library, let me read up on Christian history. I did that after I left. And as I was leaving Christianity, but when I became a Christian, it was based on a much more narrow experience of what I would call, you know, I don't even look at it now as having researched or examined or done anything like that.
Okay, so you kind of threw me off a minute ago when you said that when it came, I thought for a moment you were talking about what you mean by the word belief is different.
Yes, it is different.
Okay. Because I would just say that a belief is something that you are convinced of, that you accept. A proposition that you accept, something that you are convinced of. And you can be convinced for good reasons or bad reasons. And that's why when you went on to talk about the methodology behind it, it seemed like you still had things you were convinced of, but for bad reasons.
Or no reasons.
Sure.
And So there is an experiential difference between what I'm calling beliefs now and what I called beliefs then. The experience is that I don't accept things as true anymore based on someone telling me that I accept it as true. In other words, someone comes to you and says, this is what you believe, and you say, okay, and so you go out and defend it, but you don't really think about whether or not you...
Right, but the difference, I'm just, and this is
No,
the
this
philosophy,
is fine.
let's define the label thing here. In both cases, even when I just asked about it, you talked about my beliefs are now warranted or justified through a completely different path.
Through a path.
Right.
Yeah.
But still, in both cases, it's something that you accept to be true. Here's a proposition, I accept it.
I'm not sure that I'm not sure that even what I considered true is the same as what I consider true anymore. It was just a matter of adopting something. It was a difficult thing for me to explain.
I think I know where you're going with this. In that, yes, technically, you accepted this proposition, and that part of what you mean by belief didn't change.
Right.
But even the feeling of what you accept has changed. Yes. What it means to actually accept
what I'm labeling
something
as a belief, and I look back at what I labeled beliefs before, and
that
it's
you may not have actually believed them.
Not even. I just defended them.
Yes.
It was like, here's a thing I'm going to defend to the death, and it's like, did I even question?
Now I understand.
You know, and so I started to research this. I started looking into it, and I've made attempts to look into it before to try to figure out what in the world am I trying to describe, because as you just demonstrated, it's a very fuzzy concept. It's not something that's super clear that you can sit down and tell someone this is what's going on.
Right.
But then I came across something called identity development theories. And that was a super enlightening thing. Now, these are just models. So what these are simply frameworks that someone has created in order to give a construct to concepts of identity, how we define ourselves, and we define ourselves through beliefs in a very big way. So we define ourselves through things like our jobs, we define ourselves through things like religion, we define ourselves through our place in a family, through what matters to us, what we devote ourselves to, what we believe about things. And we spend time developing those identities. And what I'm starting to realize the more I'm reading about the research on identity and looking at identity and how it develops in toddlers and how it starts to develop in older children is an actual framework that gives some clarity to these ideas that weren't clear to me before. And there's a whole lot to the theory of identity development, but there's like a basic sort of foundational thing that breaks it into 4 sections. And so what they do is they have how committed are you to something and how much have you investigated it? Like, how much did you look into this idea and how committed are you to this idea? And then they look at 4 different labels that they use. And one is called identity diffusion, where you have a person who really isn't latched on to anything as far as identity. So this person goes through their adolescence in a way that they don't really question anything, they don't really commit to anything, they're just kind of the person that's, floating around living life, but not really goal-oriented or driven or motivated by much, right? So I think we all know people like that, who just sort of, they're not highly committed, they're not searching for what do I believe, they're just sort of not interested in developing an identity. They're just like, I just live, and I don't really care about much, I don't think about much, I don't devote myself to much, I don't commit to much, just kind of there, going about my life day to day. And then there's the other one, which is called a moratorium. And I think a lot of people who have deconverted have gone through a moratorium, which is where you go through an identity crisis usually, which means that you start wondering and questioning, what do I believe? Who am I? What am I about? Where am I going? And so in moratorium, you start researching very heavily. So you start doing a lot of investigation into different ideas and into looking into things and trying to figure out what you think about things and who you are as a person. And then there are two other categories, and both of these categories exhibit a certain level of commitment. and one is called identity foreclosure. And identity foreclosure is where I was before. Identity foreclosure is identified as having a high level of commitment and a low level of investigation. So in other words, you're extremely committed to particular ideas that you really haven't thought about.
Alex Jones.
And then you have identity achievement, which is flexible but not necessarily, where you're not going to get the rug pulled out from under you, where you've put a lot of thought into what you've come to, and where you've got a good level of commitment to the things you believe. You feel confident in who you are as a person and what you stand for, but you've also put in a lot of research and broad research. And that was the other thing that got me.
Yeah, it's got to be more. I mean, I know people who've studied something their entire life and they're still obviously wrong about it. You could research and discover how they're wrong in 5 minutes in a Google search. And it's about, which is why we're constantly, advocating for skepticism, critical thinking, and doing what you can to verify the best sources. 20 years of sloppy research isn't, that I've researched this for 20 years. Okay.
Right.
It's the substance of the evidence and the arguments.
Right, and that's the thing. When I was religious, and I did like an informal poll on one of my social media sites and asked people, how committed were you to the beliefs, and how much did you think that you had researched? Like, did you feel that you had really looked into it?
Right.
And now looking back on it, do you feel the same, that you really did, a thorough investigation of it, and maybe you overlooked a few things that kind of changed your mind, and almost universally the people who felt that they had been indoctrinated into fundamentalist religions as kids, who did believe it and consider themselves to be committed to it, said that at the time they were in it, they felt like they were doing like a lot of research.
Sure.
But you look back on it and you're like, it's all this little, and so it reminded me, the graphic that I pulled up was a child in a sandbox. And I said, it's almost like you're this kid in the sandbox, and you can dig and dig and dig all you want as long as you stay in the sandbox. But then I showed this big excavation with, a backhoe, like digging the coal. And it's like, this is where you need to be, right? And that's kind of what it is. It's like when I was a theist, all of that thought and all of that research and all of that investigation was so narrow. It was like digging a hole to China but never leaving the sandbox.
Right.
Just go deeper and deeper into the sandbox instead of ever looking outside the sandbox.
I wonder if I would have said when I was a believer that I had good reason, that I had spent time actually studying it. I wonder how many people just willingly acknowledge that, yes, I believe this and I don't have any good reason, and I haven't spent any time studying it. I would think that would be fairly rare.
I mean, we've heard people say that on the show.
That's why I wouldn't say it was nobody, but it would seem fairly rare.
But I think for a high level of commitment, most people are going to say they have looked into it.
Yeah, and the thing is, I walked down the aisle at a church when I was 5 or so and was active all the way through my teen years, to the point where, the people who knew me in that church, even 30 years later, came to a debate that I did to say, what happened to you? We thought you were going to do great things for God. I was convinced that I had studied enough right up until the point where I actually studied enough to begin to realize. But
it wasn't, when I came out of it, it wasn't like, here's the sandbox that I'm digging in, and then, there's this little thing outside it, and, that's what I needed to change my... It was like, there's this huge, vast amount of information outside the sandbox that I didn't even know to look at. That I had been trained, and this is where the indoctrination comes in, I had been trained that the sandbox was everything. I wasn't even aware there was stuff outside the sandbox.
Yeah, what's it feel like to be wrong and not be aware of it? It feels just like being right. You think you're right. Yes. And what does it feel like to think you've studied enough if you're suffering from like Dunning-Kruger effect and you don't know how much there is you don't know.
Right.
And how much there is to potentially know.
Yeah, and so then when you hit identity achievement, you're less likely to be that committed. You'll still be committed to your ideas, but you'll be more open to the idea of investigation is ongoing.
And this is one of the things I've talked about with Anthony Magnabosco, who's been using street epistemology and everything. We've had arguments. We've had great discussions. I had him on one of the Atheist Debates Project videos where we talked about this. Street epistemology is when you engage with someone and you ask them how confident they are in their belief, and then you talk to them for a few minutes, and you ask them how confident they are again, and the confidence level will lower based on the conversation. And that is a good thing. It's getting people to realize that perhaps they shouldn't be as confident, and I support that. However, it doesn't mean that you've changed somebody's mind about their foundational belief. If they've gone from 100% certain to 75%, are they actually 25% less confident, or are they just as confident, but now they report, they were exaggerating a bit when I'm absolutely sure, and you just got them to acknowledge their doubts. But if you're 75% confident, you still believe, and you still believe kind of strongly. And these are things that we can't measure. They're self-reported. They're just numbers that we approximate. And if you don't know how confident you should be, I think you're probably quickly go, I'm virtually certain. But what have you done when you get somebody to recognize after a 10-minute conversation that what they should have been reporting the whole time is 75% instead of 100? What has changed about them? And the temptation is to say that nothing has changed, which is one of the big objections street epistemology.
Oh, their awareness.
I don't think that's true. I think it's obviously false. They've at least become aware that they were, at a minimum, over-reporting their confidence.
Sure.
If not, you may have lowered their confidence, but at a minimum, you've got them to realize that they were. Now, what the worst thing can happen? Tracie comes up to me and she says she's 100% confident. We talk for 10 minutes and she says she's 75% confident, and she walks down the street and the next person she talks to asks her how confident she is, and she says she's 100% confident.
Oh, no.
Now I think we've accomplished nothing through that, but I'm optimistic that doesn't happen very often.
That's like the apologist that uses the same argument after they leave you, saying like, oh yeah, I guess that's true.
Oh, you mean every single apologist?
And then they go ask the same question to the next person.
Almost every single one of them. I've seen, and in part, it's not just that they're lying. It's they've thought through it and they think they found another loophole. I've watched Matt Slick do this. I've watched any number of apologists be shown to be wrong or have to acknowledge Ray Comfort and the banana thing and all that stuff, and then they go off and do it again because they find another way to justify it.
Well, I would just say if you're somebody that deconverted, if you're an atheist who deconverted in the way that I was just describing, and you have struggled with trying to get other people to understand this, or you've struggled trying to understand it yourself, the identity theory framework really helps to help you understand what happened to you and what it meant to be indoctrinated, and how you were limited in your capacity, and how you were basically driven to apply a strong commitment to something that you were very limited in how well you could have researched it. And then later when you find out what happened to you, it becomes very difficult to describe that to other people, and I think this is a mechanism that can help.